Welcome to the Art of Wargaming on the General Nerdery Network. I am your host, Yaga Malark. Today's episode concerns offensive variations. But before we begin, I want to give a shout out to those who support our work. Your contribution makes a huge difference. If you like what we do, give us a like, share, or review, depending on what platform you use to listen to us. Consider sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. We also try to make the journey to events around the country, where we can bring you fresh and exciting perspectives. If you'd like to aid in that effort, head on over to our Patreon and join our elite force of supporters. My own wargaming right now has been a little dry. A good portion of my opponents, as we talked about last time, have either had the audacity to get married and are enjoying their new life and getting prepared for what comes next. Some of them have been busy doing other projects. So there hasn't been a whole lot of actual wargaming in my life currently, if I'm being honest. I'd like to change that. So if you're one of my usual opponents and you're listening to this show, please consider reaching out, because I would love to get a game or two in of whatever you decide, whether it be Warhammer 40k, Kill Team. I'll be going to Belagarth tomorrow on Sunday, so hit me up. I would love to fight with you. This is going to be a relatively short intro today because I'm very much eager to resume our project of working through Clausewitz. So, let's get into it and talk about this first series of offensive variations. As we begin our discussion on offensive variations, there are two different types that we need to consider. There is an attack with the intent of a great decision, or an attack without the goal of a great decision. As we'll hear, the second one, the attack without a goal of that great decision, is by far the most advantageous, and you're about to hear why. As we get into this is a trap that is easy to fall into in wargaming. When we look at the board, when we look at our opponent, that idea of a dramatic conclusion, one action that wins the entire battle, is tempting. It's something that we've been prepared for by every Hollywood movie. But when it comes to reality, when it comes to the best way to proceed forward, well, Clausewitz has some things to say about that. Let's begin with the attack with the purpose of a great decision. The first aim of this is victory, of course. And while it is assumed for victory, a sudden attack and surprise rarely work. When they do, they're absolutely devastating. But if they do not, they often leave us unprepared for what comes next, and out of position for whatever counter our enemy may throw in there. If we are attempting this, superiority is needed in as many ways as possible. The numbers of our overall army, the gear and equipment that we have at our disposal, the training that our troops may have, or that we have using that army, morale, and other such factors. As many of these superiorities as can be gathered is for the best. Prudence is for the defender, as self-confidence and boldness are to the attacker. Remember, as a defender, and I know it was a long time ago that we were going over this particular topic, but as a defender, every single thing matters. Making sure that we have as many of the possibilities on our side helps us set the field for what comes next. But if we are attacking with the intent of a great decision, we need to be self-confident in what we're doing, and we need to be bold, because to hold back or to doubt oneself in these moments, it leads to ruin. Remember this concept that Clausewitz has developed, this idea of the fog of war. When we are doing this great decision, it demands a different approach. We are to understand that we don't know, perhaps, where all of our enemy is located. what their exact disposition is, their numbers, material, training. We don't necessarily know what moves they might be making. And so when dealing with this fog of war, we have to understand that our opponent is dealing with the same issue. And if we are bold in what we are doing, we can often overcome the uncertainty that lies in that fog. What do we want to do when we're doing this great decision? Well, the first thing is to try to draw out the defender. Remember, as a defender, we're trying to make sure that the ground is prepared in the best way that we can, that there are choke points, overlapping fields of fire, mines, barricades, or whatever else might be at our disposal. So, as the attacker in this situation, we want to make sure that we draw the defender out of whatever fortifications or preparations they may have made. And this particular form of attack is not just an aim for any sort of object, but as a conqueror, as somebody who is using military force to accomplish what we need. Now, when it comes to this object, it may not be our aim, but we have to understand if it might be the defender's aim. So if we can position ourselves between the defender and their object, rather than just take the object, that accomplishes this goal of drawing the defender out. We also must have the ability to make use of our victory, because a military conquest in of itself, while being dramatic, may not be what we need for a true victory in the war. And so we might want to consider political, economic, or morale-based targets that have a long-lasting effect, that exist and persist after the battle has ended. Our next point deals with dividing our forces. Don't do it, is the short answer. But if you have vastly superior numbers, it might be a good idea. But remember what we had talked about in previous episodes, where an army that may consist of 2 versus another army that may consist of 2 units, if the first army splits into 2 sections of 1, and the defender is canny and wily, then they might engage 2v1 and then 2v1, making it so they have numeric superiority in both of these engagements. So, unless we have vastly superior numbers where we can deal with such a counterattack, it is not a good idea to divide our forces, but to come at our opponent with one large fist. And our last thing to consider when we're attacking for a great decision is our own prudence when dealing with our lines of communication and our lines of retreat. Self-confidence and boldness need not become arrogance and recklessness, because these two lead to folly. So, when we're making this grand, massive attack, making sure that if it does not work, we are able to flee from the place and reassess at a different location. Now let's talk about attacking without the goal of a great decision, which is what the majority of battles throughout history have done, and which is what we do for the majority of our battles when we're doing something within wargaming, whether it be physical or intellectual. When we're doing this, it is directed at a secondary objective, something that is not simply a decisive military victory of the conqueror, but something else that we are acquiring and perhaps engaging in that battle to do so. What sorts of objectives are good for this particular method of warfare? Well, the first one would be a strip of territory, something that we can gain, whether that be something that offers subsistence, a contribution to our army in some material way, a buffer zone between ourselves and enemy strongpoints, or perhaps for bargaining in the future. We also might target principal magazines, and from this object, it gives us the means for our next object. Because capturing our opponent's supply depots, whether they be weapons or food or whatever else might be important, this gives us the means to move on to something else. The magazine itself isn't necessarily the final objective, but one that leads, as I said, to the next one. The next object that we might consider is the capture of fortresses, which is something that we will go into further detail on later in this episode. And then we're talking about a successful combat, not necessarily a massive decisive victory, not necessarily something that is large and dramatic, but successful. How do we measure a successful combat? Well, it's something that accomplishes us trophies, for one thing, whether that be standards from the enemy, prisoners of war, or within the idea of wargaming, potentially objectives, or other such secondary things. Successful combats can also lead to an increase in morale. There have been many times throughout history where an army's commander has taken their army against an easily overcome opponent, or an easily overcome place where the opponent is weak, in order to bolster their army's morale. Nothing bolsters morale like a good victory. And a successful combat may help satisfy our own ambition and drive us to further glory. When we're looking at these successful combats, we must also consider if they fulfill an adequate prospect of victory and is not overly dependent on the ability to deliver a heavy strike. Combat is not necessarily sought in this particular form of an offensive variation, this idea of attacking without the goal of a great decision, but it is often viewed as a necessary evil. In these cases, we try to win through guile, through maneuver, moving and threatening our opponent's lines of communication or lines of retreat, and perhaps going after important points, bridges, choke points in a mountain pass, and other such things. So the combat itself isn't necessarily the goal of this form of warfare, but it can be anticipated. It is also good when doing this to threaten subsistence. This draws the defender out, much like we were looking to do for a great decision. But it also cuts our opponents off from needed supply. An army marches on its stomach, Napoleon is famed to have said, but this much is true. So going after our opponent's way of subsistence, how they sustain their army, is extremely effective when we're looking for a victory in this way. So when we look at this, attacking without the goal of a great decision is more advantageous than seeking that great decision because it allows us a greater degree of flexibility when achieving our objectives. As I said earlier, we were going to talk about the attack of fortresses. It might be a good time to get into that. The capture of fortresses weakens the opponent's defense while strengthening our own offense. Though if we have a weak offensive force, it will weaken it even further because it causes a loss of momentum. Sieges are long and sometimes costly, and while they absolutely favor the attacker, it also pauses our army in a fixed location where our opponent can then move upon us. We can call a fortress an end to itself and not necessarily a means if it fulfills some of the following requirements. If the fortress is small and isolated, makes it easier to overcome, and makes it harder for our opponent to maneuver upon us while we are conducting our siege. A fortress can also be a bargaining chip for peace in the future, should we so seek it in this way. The siege actually gives progress to our attack, for some of the reasons mentioned before. It can increase morale by achieving a victory that is not only something on the field, but real and tangible, that our troops can use for support, for protection. So even though there is a loss of momentum, it can lend strength to our overall attack. And siege, when uninterrupted by outside influence, is an enterprise without catastrophe. A siege can be easily kept, especially if our own lines of communication and lines of supply remain intact. We can wait out the enemy. They have a limited supply of resources, of material, and certainly of food that will be whittled down through time. Another way that we can conduct a siege without catastrophe is if we have the means of taking it on hand, whether those be breaching ladders, sappers, artillery, or any other means of acquiring that fortress, it can be done without catastrophe in this way. A fortress can also strengthen our defenses, which seems obvious. It gives us a solid place to maneuver from and protect ourselves. So whether we want to use it for storing material as a magazine or as a garrison, these are both things that a fortress can give us and why it is useful to acquire one. It also gives us a place to store our material and siege equipment for the next possibility of taking another fortress. And when we're considering this siege, we want to make sure that our lines are not too spread out, and especially if we're considering the size of the garrison, it may take longer and be more difficult. So this is good information to have. And when we're doing so, we want to make sure that we have a secondary defensive line of circumvallation. Remember the great example of Julius Caesar when he was sieging a Gallic fortress, and when he heard that there was another relief force coming, he built a second line of defenses facing outward to make sure that they were ready to receive those attackers when they came. So this means that there is a defensive line pointing in towards the fortress that we are sieging, and another defensive line on the other side of it pointing outwards in order to make sure that we are not caught unawares by a force that we may not have anticipated. This is how we attack fortresses. Next, let's really talk about the attack of convoys. And while I understand that some of these parts of the offensive variations that we're going to be discussing may be more or less applicable to wargaming, I wanted to make sure that I at least touch on them so you're getting the full information that Clausewitz can offer. So briefly speaking, attacking convoys can be extremely valuable to our own forces. This means that we're attacking a line of retreat, a line of communication, or a line of supply. And when we're doing this, we're positioning ourselves to minimize the retaliation from the enemy while maximizing the damage or disruption that we can do to these lines. Any convoys that are successfully attacked might yield additional material or subsistence that we can use for our own forces. Next, let's talk about the attack of a camp. This is a place where surprise is absolutely necessary, because a successful surprise attack can disrupt our enemy, cause them to retreat, or result in a full rout. Though it is hard to depend on these surprises, it also matters what the position is in the theater. Is the ground rocky and craggy? Does it have marshes or forests that can disguise our action? There were multiple times during the American Civil War where there were attacks against camps that were extremely successful at routing an army that otherwise might have proven too large to properly face. And I think it goes without saying, but let's make sure that we stress it real quick, this must be against an army that has yet to assemble. Otherwise, it's just attacking another army. But if we can catch our opponent while they are eating their evening meal, washing their laundry, or doing other menial tasks in which they are not prepared to receive us, this is ideal. What are the advantages of attacking our opponent's camp beyond the obvious? Well, firstly, our defender must choose a different point of assembly, which often means that they are losing ground in a disordered fashion. Another advantage of this, when properly executed, is that surprise that we speak of. The surprise enables us to engage an enemy while they are fractured, which means that we can get local numeric superiority and have the ability to inflict heavy casualties. And finally, a disorganized force that has been caught unawares like this finds it very difficult to assemble in a timely and orderly fashion to be able to strike back at us. What strategic means do we have in order to make an attack on a camp successful? Well, the first is to hit multiple areas at once and cut them off from each other. This is another great way of sustaining our local numeric superiority. We could also stage a converse attack on the assembly point, their line of retreat, or their lines of communication, to sow even greater disorder among them. We can attack with great determination and the boldness that we offer in that first form of attack where we're seeking a great decision. When we look at a larger theater, this enables us potentially to turn the flank of our opponent and to hit them at an oblique angle that is extremely effective for, say it with me, local numeric superiority. With our preparement, we can balance our three arms of the military. Remember that these are infantry, cavalry, and artillery. We can then sustain rapid movement because we know that our opponent is on the back foot and unable to strike back in an overly effective manner. Though when we're doing so, we must remember to have a rally point in case we need to retreat. Remember that nothing is certain in warfare, and perhaps we've caught an enemy who is extremely adept at assembling quickly, or has made provisions or plans to anticipate such an attack. So making sure that we do have a rally point that all commanders know about to fall back to is important so that we ourselves are not caught unawares. Our next offensive variation is the diversion. This is a very misunderstood form of attack. People often think of it as being something that doesn't really have much weight, but is meant to distract the enemy. This is not always the case. A diversion can be defined as an incursion into enemy territory with the intent of drawing off some of the enemy force from another objective. However, this attack must have a believable object of that attack. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter. If our opponent sees us assembling in an area that has little strategic significance or where they are easily able to repel us, this won't succeed in our objective of drawing the enemy away and making sure that they are unprepared for whatever comes next. A diversion can be very risky because it divides our forces between whatever our main force is and our diversionary force. The larger the force that is used for this diversion, the greater the risk to our overall effort if it goes poorly. What sort of favorable circumstances do we have where a diversion might be a good idea for us? Well, the first one would be having sufficient forces that the overall army retains the critical mass of force. If we are not taking away from our ability to properly fight a battle against an enemy who might move against that main force, this is a good time to potentially do a diversion. If there are points available that are important to the opponent or to ourselves and can be threatened, this also presents a favorable circumstance. If we are moving into an area that has discontented subjects, people who are more than willing to rise up against somebody they may see as an oppressor or a foreign invader, this itself is also a favorable circumstance. And the last one would be if it is a rich province with plenty to raid, so that our efforts can be rewarded materially. This is also a favorable circumstance. This often opens up an area of war that was not yet planned for by our opponent. If they were sitting there anticipating attack from our main force, but suddenly we have also hit elsewhere, now they have to reconsider, regroup, and re-plan what they were intending to do in the first place. What does the execution of a diversion look like? Well, firstly, it must be a real attack. As we said, it has to have some sort of believable object of attack, and if it is not resisted by our opponent, the weight and intent behind it to actually make it successful. Remember, a diversion isn't necessarily just a feint that we do in order to distract the enemy. It is something real that, if unopposed, we can actually follow through on and find our victory. We also want to make sure that we appear larger or more threatening than we actually are. This has been done several times throughout the course of this long and grueling war in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians have used some sort of diversion to bleed off some of the superior numbers that the Russians have and engage them in a way that is more favorable to themselves. And lastly, if a smaller force is used, they need to make sure that they have a retreat/rally point and that they have the reserves to back this up. The last thing we need is an attack that is not only unsuccessful, but also destroys a useful wing of our army. In this way, we can make a diversion, but we must do so carefully, with calculation, and with great consideration. In this particular episode, I was intending on also covering the section that Clausewitz has on the concept of invasion, but it is a long enough and complicated enough subject that I think it deserves an episode all of its own. So I appreciate you listening, and we'll be back again with invasion.